Part 1. The Accused Genius. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon in the small, sleepy town of Lexington. The courtrooms weren't exactly where you'd find excitement, especially in a district known for its quiet streets and close-knit community. But today, things were about to change. The courthouse buzzed with an unusual energy. People whispered about the new case on the docket, one that had been drawing attention from all over the town. A high school senior named Ryan Williams was being accused of hacking into the school's computer system. The story was strange. Ryan was known around town as a quiet kid, someone who kept to himself and spent most of his time with his head buried in books, especially those about technology. He wasn't the typical troublemaker. In fact, most of his classmates had no idea that he was even capable of something like hacking. But that's what the school had accused him of. For weeks, the school's computer network had been compromised. Important files had been deleted, and sensitive data had been leaked. The principal, in an attempt to find the culprit, had called in the local police. After a brief investigation, they zeroed in on Ryan, who, to everyone's shock, was immediately arrested. The idea that a 17-year-old kid, who was, by all accounts, a bookish genius, could be behind such an elaborate cyber attack didn't sit well with most people. Inside the courtroom, a sense of anticipation filled the air. The defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Carol Henderson, adjusted her glasses and sat quietly, studying the documents in front of her. She knew that this case wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about proving Ryan's innocence. It was about understanding the layers of his involvement, or lack thereof. The judge, Judge Samuel Brooks, had already established a reputation for being tough. He had no tolerance for delays, excuses, or nonsense. His sharp gaze pierced the room as he waited for the proceedings to begin. He looked over at the young defendant, Ryan, who was sitting with his head slightly lowered, his nervous hands clutched together. Ryan was an enigma to many. On one hand, he had the mind of a tech wizard, someone who could solve complicated coding problems effortlessly. On the other hand, he was painfully shy and socially awkward. Most of his classmates barely knew him. He had few friends, preferring instead to spend his time coding, gaming, and reading about computer systems and cybersecurity. It was a passion that ran deep. He was always tinkering with machines, figuring out how they worked, and even building his own programs from scratch. His natural curiosity had earned him top grades in his computer science classes, making him a standout student. But this talent had inadvertently become his downfall. As the trial began, Judge Brooks wasted no time. He glanced to the prosecutor, a man named Gregory Holt, who was ready to make his case. "Mr. Holt, you may begin," Judge Brooks said, his voice authoritative and unwavering. Gregory stood up, adjusting his tie and clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we stand in this courtroom to discuss an act of sheer deception, an act that was orchestrated by a young man with an uncanny understanding of technology. Ryan Williams stands accused of hacking into his own school's computer system, an act that could have had disastrous consequences for the entire community. The data he tampered with wasn't just random files. It included confidential records, financial documents, and personal information. The severity of this breach cannot be overstated." Ryan's heart began to race. The words felt like a blur. He wanted to stand up and shout that he didn't do it, that he wasn't a criminal. But he knew he couldn't. He wasn't sure how to explain himself, let alone prove his innocence. All he had was the truth, and he didn't know how to make it sound convincing to a jury that might see him as nothing more than a troubled teenager with too much time on his hands. "Ryan Williams," Gregory continued, "is no ordinary teenager. He's a prodigy in the field of technology. He's the kind of person who could break into systems without leaving a trace, which is exactly what he did. We will present evidence that shows Ryan had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to carry out this crime. His knowledge of the school's computer network is well documented. He was given access to it for educational purposes, but instead, he used that access to exploit the system for his own gain." The prosecutor's words hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just a simple accusation, it was an indictment of Ryan's character. And as much as Ryan wanted to deny everything, the evidence seemed to pile up against him. His reputation as a tech genius was being used against him, painting a picture of a brilliant mind gone rogue. At the defense table, Carol Henderson exchanged a brief glance with Ryan. She could see the fear in his eyes. This wasn't just a fight for his future, it was a fight for his freedom. If they couldn't prove his innocence, everything he had worked for would come crashing down. But there was something Carol didn't know yet, something that Ryan had never told anyone. He wasn't the only one who could hack. In fact, there was someone who was far more skilled than he was. Someone who had been manipulating him without Ryan even realizing it. The first part of the trial ended with Judge Brooks looking down at Ryan with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "We'll reconvene tomorrow," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I expect all parties to come prepared with evidence. Let's see if Mr. Williams has an explanation for his alleged actions." Ryan's mind raced. He couldn't sit here quietly anymore. He had to do something. He had to tell them the truth, no matter what it cost. As he was led out of the courtroom, his thoughts were already formulating a plan. It wasn't going to be easy, but Ryan was determined to clear his name. Little did he know, his journey was about to take a turn that would uncover something far more complex than anyone could have imagined. And the real story of what happened that day would only start to unfold in the next part of the trial. Part 2. The Unlikely Ally. The next morning, the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension. As the doors opened and the judge entered, the spectators fell silent. Judge Samuel Brooks took his seat, the gavel ringing out with authority. The trial was about to resume. Ryan sat in his seat, feeling like a deer in headlights. Carol Henderson, his defense attorney, sat beside him, flipping through her notes. There was no turning back now. The jury had already heard the prosecution's arguments, and now it was their turn to mount a defense. The odds were stacked against them, and every word mattered. Judge Brooks looked down at the defense table, his gaze landing on Carol. "Ms. Henderson," he said, his voice sharp, "it's your turn. Please proceed." Carol stood up slowly, smoothing down her blazer. She was no stranger to high-stakes trials, but this one felt different. There was something about Ryan's case that nagged at her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She was determined to find out the truth, even if it meant digging deeper than anyone expected. She cleared her throat and addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we stand here today with a young man who has been accused of a crime he did not commit. Ryan Williams is a bright, talented student, and while the prosecution has painted him as a hacker, we believe there is more to this story. There's more than meets the eye." Ryan felt a slight sense of relief as Carol spoke. Her voice was calm, reassuring, everything he needed to hear right now. She wasn't giving up on him. Carol turned to the jury. "We have gathered evidence that casts doubt on the idea that Ryan is the perpetrator. The very nature of the breach suggests that it was someone with more experience, someone who knew how to cover their tracks. Ryan is an exceptional student, yes, but he's not a criminal mastermind. He wouldn't have been able to carry out such a sophisticated attack without someone teaching him, or even manipulating him." She paused, looking around the room to gauge the jury's reaction. She was setting the stage for something bigger, something that would change the entire course of the trial. The prosecutor, Gregory Holt, shot her skeptical glance but said nothing. Carol wasn't finished. "We intend to show that someone with a deeper knowledge of cybersecurity, someone with more expertise than Ryan, was behind this hack. And that person might just be someone you least expect." At that moment, a murmur ran through the courtroom. Carol's words had sparked curiosity. The idea that Ryan had been manipulated or framed was intriguing. The jury leaned forward, eager to hear more. Ryan sat up straighter. He had no idea what Carol was talking about. Who could have been behind this? He had never shared his knowledge of computers with anyone, let alone allowed someone else to manipulate him. But the more he thought about it, the more a troubling thought crept into his mind. There was one person who might know enough about him to pull something like this off, someone he'd met online. It wasn't a friend, exactly, more like an acquaintance, or rather a mentor. Ryan had stumbled upon a chat forum dedicated to cybersecurity when he was just starting to learn about the darker sides of the internet. It was there that he met someone named Shadow. Shadow was an expert in hacking, a self-proclaimed digital mercenary. He offered Ryan advice on his projects and helped him with coding problems. But over time, Shadow's messages became more cryptic, more demanding. Ryan hadn't heard from Shadow in weeks, but he knew that the man had access to the kind of skills that could pull off a hack like the one that had gotten him into this mess. Could Shadow have framed him? Before Ryan could dwell on the thought, Carol continued, "We're also bringing in a key witness today, someone who has information that could change everything. This individual is an expert in cybersecurity and has looked at the evidence closely. We're confident that they can shed light on the true identity of the person who orchestrated the hack." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The tension in the air thickened. Who was this mystery witness? Could they really exonerate Ryan? Ryan felt his heart pound as Carol's words sank in. He wanted to believe that they could prove his innocence, but how could anyone trust a witness who claimed to know the truth? What if they were just another part of the conspiracy? His mind raced with questions. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and a tall figure walked in. The room went quiet as a man in his mid-30s, wearing a crisp suit, stepped into the witness stand. He had short, dark hair and an air of confidence that seemed to exude from every movement. Carol smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Marcus Hale, a cybersecurity expert who has helped law enforcement agencies track down some of the most dangerous cybercriminals in the world." Ryan watched in disbelief. Dr. Hale was a name he recognized. He had read articles about him online. The man was a legend in the world of digital forensics. If anyone could figure out what had happened to the school's computer system, it was him. Dr. Hale adjusted his glasses as he sat down. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I've reviewed the evidence presented in this case, and I have some important insights that I believe will help clarify the situation." Gregory Holt, the prosecutor, stood up, a look of skepticism on his face. "Dr. Hale, are you telling us that you found evidence that suggests Ryan Williams didn't commit this crime?" Dr. Hale nodded, his expression serious. "Correct." After analyzing the logs, it became clear that the hack wasn't the work of a novice. The methods used were highly sophisticated, far beyond what an average high school student like Mr. Williams would be capable of. The attack was planned, not impulsive. It was done with a level of precision that suggests the involvement of someone with extensive experience in the field. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. The words he'd been waiting for were finally spoken. There was hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the hacker after all. Dr. Hale continued, his tone unwavering. "Furthermore, I found evidence that suggests someone with access to Mr. Williams' personal computer network may have had a hand in this. Someone with significant knowledge of his work and interests, someone who could have guided him in the execution of this attack." Ryan's mind raced. Was this the breakthrough he needed? Could the person who had been manipulating him online finally be exposed? "Are you suggesting that Ryan Williams was framed?" Gregory Holt asked, incredulous. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting," Dr. Hale replied. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Part 3. The Breaking Point. Ryan sat frozen in his seat, his pulse hammering in his ears. The entire courtroom seemed to lean in, hanging on to Dr. Hale's last words. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting," Hale had said. Ryan Williams was framed. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Then, all at once, the room erupted. Spectators whispered to one another, jurors shifted in their seats, and even Judge Brooks raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Gregory Holt, the prosecutor, quickly stood up, his expression a mix of skepticism and frustration. "Objection, Your Honor. That's a serious claim with no solid evidence." Judge Brooks held up a hand, silencing the room. "Dr. Hale, do you have proof of this?" Dr. Hale nodded, calm and methodical. "I do." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "After analyzing the digital footprint left behind in the hack, I found inconsistencies that indicate someone else may have orchestrated this attack. Someone with extensive knowledge of Ryan's habits, online activity, and skill level." The prosecutor crossed his arms. "And who exactly do you believe was behind this?" Dr. Hale exhaled, flipping through his file. "There's a hacker who goes by the alias Shadow. He's known in underground cybersecurity circles, a ghost in the digital world. We found traces of his coding signature embedded in the attack. It's sophisticated, but not invisible." Ryan's breath hitched. Shadow. It was a name he hadn't thought about in weeks, until now. He'd met Shadow on an online cybersecurity forum, a mysterious but knowledgeable figure who had taken an interest in his coding progress. They had exchanged messages, even collaborated on small, harmless projects. But could Shadow have really done this? Ryan felt his hands clench into fists beneath the table. Had he been played? Carol Henderson leaned toward Ryan and whispered, "Do you know anything about this?" Ryan hesitated, his throat dry. I knew Shadow, but I never thought." He swallowed hard. "He was just some guy online. I never gave him access to anything." Carol turned back toward the witness stand. "Dr. Hale, is there any way to prove that Shadow is responsible?" Hale nodded. "We're close. I've been working with a cybersecurity team to track Shadow's location. If we can find him, we might be able to get the confession we need." Holt wasn't ready to back down. This is speculation. Even if this shadow exists, how do we know Ryan wasn't involved? What if he worked with this hacker? Hale turned the page in his file. Actually, we found something else. A conversation. A direct message exchange between Ryan and Shadow. Ryan's blood ran cold. What? Hale placed a printed transcript on the table. Shadow was messaging Ryan frequently before the hack. At first, it was harmless coding advice. But then it changed. Carol grabbed the papers and scanned them. Her expression darkened. Ryan, she said, her voice low. Did you ever talk to Shadow about your school's network? Ryan thought back, his mind racing. He had never meant to. He was careful about that sort of thing. But then a memory surfaced. A chat from weeks ago, late at night, where Shadow had casually asked, "Hey, how's that school firewall set up? Ever think about testing it just for fun?" His stomach dropped. He had answered, "Just a little. The system is outdated, pretty weak security, honestly." Ryan had thought nothing of it. He had assumed Shadow was just making conversation. But now he realized he had given Shadow everything he needed to break in. Ryan felt his body go numb. I didn't think," his voice trailed off. Judge Brooks was watching him carefully. "Mr. Williams, is there something you'd like to say?" Ryan swallowed hard. "I never hacked the school." But he hesitated. "I might have told the wrong person too much." The courtroom fell silent. Carol took a deep breath, setting the papers down. "Your Honor, this changes everything." Ryan may have been naive, but he wasn't the hacker. He was manipulated. Judge Brooks folded his hands. "Mr. Williams, let me be clear. You're telling this court that this hacker, Shadow, used your knowledge to carry out this attack?" Ryan nodded slowly. "I think so." Gregory Holt was already shaking his head. "This is a convenient story, but it doesn't change the facts. The hack came from Ryan's IP address." Dr. Hale spoke up. "Not necessarily. If Shadow is as skilled as I believe, he could have masked his location, made it look like the attack came from Ryan's system." Carol jumped on it. "Which means Ryan's computer was used without his knowledge." Judge Brooks let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. "This is getting complicated." He turned to Dr. Hale. "How long will it take to track this Shadow down?" Hale checked his phone. "We're already working on it." He looked up. "And if we're lucky, we might get a lead before this trial is over." The courtroom was buzzing again. Whispers filled the air. For the first time since his arrest, Ryan felt something he hadn't in weeks: hope. But as he glanced at the prosecutor's grim expression, he knew this wasn't over yet. Not even close.